great opportunity for us to get together to improve our processes, to understand more effectively how we can run our meetings and ensure that we're in compliance with Iowa state law, I assume. And so we're really appreciative to have Nikki Shield from the Iowa League of Cities and Towns here to provide us a little bit of training and help us to be more cohesive as boards and committees and councils in our community so we can best serve our residents. So I'll turn the time over to you. Sure.
Do I need to speak into the mic? Is this being recorded?
Actually, the Zoom people could hear you.
Zoom?
better,
Yeah,
too.
they can hear you back.
Okay. Hello to the Zoom
I should've
people.
been doing it. Sorry.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all for inviting me down and having me. Thanks to Ben and welcome to Iowa and welcome to Indianola. It's great to be here. My name is Mickey Shields. I'm with the Iowa League of Cities. I am the Director of Membership Services at the League. And real quick, in case I know some of you know us pretty well, and some of you may not, the League is a nonprofit association made up of members that are city governments. Our members are based on the city itself, not individuals. So Indianola is certainly a member of the League, which means all of its elected officials, appointed officials, staff members are part of the League. And so all of our services, our resources are available to all of you, including our staff, myself, and the membership services team. Most of our job is daily answering calls and emails from city officials across the state on everything under the sun. Every city out there has to comply with all sorts of things. We'll get into the open meetings here tonight, which is a big one. But there's all kinds of things that no matter if you're a very small city of 50 residents or a city of Des Moines, the capital city, those laws apply to you equally. And so our job, we really have two main services the League provides. One of those is education and training, which is really the membership services department. And then we advocate for city governments on behalf of cities at the Capitol. So that's your League of Cities. But again, if you have any of you have any questions, anytime, please let us know. We're happy to help. And that goes for tonight. If there's any questions as I go, I prefer to be stopped along the way rather than wait till the end. So if anything is popping up on the screen or anything I say that you want some clarification on, anything relevant to your meetings here in Indianola, whether it's council, P&Z, what do we, by the way, what the planning and zoning is here, some folks, Board of Adjustment. I know there was kind of a mix of the various boards and commissions along with some council members too. So we got a mix of some of the appointed boards, Park Board, Library Board. Anyone raise hands? Okay. Municipal Utility Board. Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So you're one of the cities that has a separate municipal utility board. I forget how many there are in Iowa. Not a lot of cities have those, but there's a fair number. As we dive into this, just be mindful of a lot of this presentation. When I give this, it's usually for a city council. So some of our slides will reference council members or city council or mayor. The state law, and I'll cover this, the open meetings law will apply to your appointed boards too. So just because I might say council or the slide might say council, just be mindful that it does cover the appointed boards, like your library board, your utility board, park boards, and all that. All right. So let's get into it.
Maybe can I?
Oh, sir.
Make a suggestion and go around the room and do something?
Oh, yes. I apologize. I assumed you all know each other. The way you were talking before I got started, it seemed like you all knew each other well enough, but maybe that's not the case. So yes, I started Mickey Shields at League of Cities. We'll go to my left.
Afton Bradley, Recreation Coordinator at Parks and Recreation with the Veterans Memorial Aquatic Center Commission.
Brad Green, I'm with the Veterans Memorial.
Christina Beach, Ward 4, City Council.
Al Ferris on Planning and Zoning.
Beth Miller with the Civil Service Commission.
Dom Selgrade, IMU Board.
Deb White, IME Board.
Lori Smith, IME Board.
Steve Richardson, City Council.
On Valley City Council.
And Doug Allen, Parks and Recreation. Eli DePaul, Public Works Department.
I'm Charlie Self, Economic Development Director.
And Reed, City Manager.
Heather Sinclair, hometown pride.
Cool.
Melissa Zones, hometown pride.
Andy Ledger.
Mita Christensen, the sustainability committee. Margaret Vernon, with the sustainability committee.
Great. Some of you are familiar. And Andy used to be a League staff member, by the way. So I'm following his footsteps. And there's still some remnants of Andy's lead time in the office that we keep for keepsake. It's great to meet you all. So this really does cover pretty much all of the city in different ways, different departments, different services you provide, certainly the boards and committees that the city has to help set policy and set direction for the city. So that's great. It's great that you're giving up another night. I'm sure you have other night meetings with your duties with the city. So I definitely appreciate you willing to spend some time with me tonight. I might be doing this wrong. I'm trying to put a slide. I'm going to ask for some help. Well, on here, it's, I'm advancing the slide, but it's not.
You're on dual screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I figure out what.
I may have, yeah, it's like one of those. All right, there we go. All right. Thank you.
Good job.
Gold star. So the first handful of slides I have are really about the basics of the open meetings law. There's another presentation I give that's entirely on the open meetings law itself. That's, I think, 30 some slides. So we could really go into the weeds on that. But for this conversation, I wanted to just have a handful of slides on that and then get in some guidance on effective meetings. It may not be necessarily under the state law, but more about using good tips and tools for having good meetings. But that being said, you have to start at the start. And the foundation for all meetings in Iowa for governmental meetings is the state code. And that's chapter 21. That's the open meetings law. This governs really any governmental body. And we'll get into the definition of governmental bodies here next. But the main takeaway at the heart of this law, of course, is that your deliberations, your meetings, your decisions are public. They're transparent. In city council is probably the biggest and most common example, of course, at the city government level, but it also pertains to the boards and commissions that are appointed by the council. So it's important to understand that it's not just that elected body. It can be the appointed ones too. But again, the main intent, the heart of the law is that you make your decisions in a public fashion. So what is a meeting? Everybody heard that phrase quorum before, the term quorum. It's a majority of that governmental body. So most cities in Iowa, they have a 5-member city council. What does it take to get to a quorum for that? 3 members, pretty simple. It's a little bit different when it gets to, I've heard of library boards that have 9 members and planning and zoning commissions often have 7 members. So obviously that math changes depending on the governmental body, but the quorum is necessary to have a meeting. If you do not get to a quorum, you cannot have a meeting, an official meeting. You can have an informal meeting at that point. In fact, I was just talking to a city council this morning, a city council member this morning, and they were a 5-member council that only 2 people showed up last night for their meeting. And so they basically had to cancel that meeting, unfortunately, because you can't have a meeting at that point. They probably should have thought that through a little bit better, but the state code, of course, requires you have a quorum in order to have an official meeting. The other piece of this that is really important is that bottom part where it says deliberation or action. It doesn't just have to be where you're going to vote on something. What does deliberation mean? That could mean discussion, conversations about potential policies. And the biggest thing that's changed here with the advent of cell phones and iPads and all kinds of devices, social media, of course, is that deliberation now is not just here in City Hall or at the public workshop or at the recreation center when you're having your in-person meetings. Nowadays, we have to be very mindful that if you text or email, like a group text to the council or to the park board, and then the people on that board start responding to each other, that's deliberation, okay? The second you do that, you have violated the state code of Iowa, okay? So you have to be very careful with that. The biggest thing that we tell cities, because a lot of cities, of course, want to use email and texts and, whatever communication they have available to share information, and you should. That's a timely way of doing it, obviously. But what a lot of city clerks and city managers have been doing, and city attorneys, is to have some kind of statement at the bottom says, do not reply all, or do not use this to have a group discussion, as doing so would be a violation of the open meetings law. It should be informational only. It should really be one way only. Okay. And if you have, as a board member or as a council member, some sort of policy question, you can directly ask a staff member, okay, well, what does this mean? Or where did I misplaced that resolution. I forgot to grab that budget document. Can you send it to me? All that's fine. Okay. But the group texting, the group chatting, that if it's not at a council meeting or at an official called meeting of your board or commission, that's going to be a violation. Okay. That's probably been the biggest issue the last several years, as more and more people, of course, use that for communication, those devices.
Could you explain the difference between formal and informal?
Absolutely. And that actually leads me into the next slide. So thank you. Now, informal or formal, what they're trying to get at is that informal would be like the group texting or the group emailing. Obviously, it's not a formal meeting that's been called by the city government, but it could be a meeting because you're deliberating as a group, as a body, as long as there's a quorum of it on that chain, whatever is being used. But on the other hand, it does not pertain to social gatherings, ministerial things, what the state code says, which would basically be like ribbon cuttings, potlucks, celebrations, things of that nature, where you're not going to deliberate on city business. You're certainly not going to vote on city business. You're fine to still be together as a group. Okay, you can be in a quorum. You can have 3 council members on a 5-member council bump into each other at a ball game. As long as they steer clear of discussing city business, you're fine. You're not violating the state code. Now, with that said, be cautious, because even if it's an impromptu gathering, we've got small towns in Iowa, of course, where they've got relatives on the council and they have a family reunion. You could easily get to a quorum with just that family reunion, cousins and brothers and aunts and uncles, all that. And it's actually pretty common in small town Iowa that that's the case. So even though they have no intention, it has nothing to do with the city government, they're just there as a family, it may look bad to the public. If they're off, 3 council members are off to the side, kind of whispering about this or that, they may not be talking anything about city business. They may be talking about the high school football game or something like that. But perception sometimes is reality. And so that's where, even if you're not violating the code, if you find yourself at a social gathering of some sort and you look around and you say, oh, there's 2 other commission members, I make a quorum by now walking in this room. I should maybe say hi and just say, hey, let's not talk tonight. I love you guys, we're friends and all, but it's going to look bad if we're over here chatting as a group. Okay. So that's the other piece to this, that even if you have the best intentions, some citizens or media members may say like, well, that's something's bad going on over there. Okay. And now you got a problem on your hands. So there's a little gray area to this law at times, but just be careful. Any questions there? Okay. The other thing about this, I should have said before, you can always chat one-on-one, right? Less than a quorum, especially that 5-member council is kind of the common example that we have, where 3 and above would be a quorum. But if it's 2 council members talking over here, one-on-one, meeting up at a coffee shop to chat, even about city business, you're fine. You're less than a quorum. That being said, there's another thing. Has anyone heard of this phrase, walking quorum? So that's where you have 2 members talking over here. One of those 2 goes to a 3rd member. How are you going to vote? That member goes to another member. How are you going to vote? Suddenly, everyone's indicated how they're going to vote, not as a group, but it's a walking quorum. That is also illegal. Okay, so you got to be careful with that. That's even more gray, because it's going to be hard to prove, but they're having court cases that have resulted from just that, where there was kind of a walking quorum. They walked from one house to the next. That's where the phrase came from. Okay, so what is a governmental body? We kind of covered this before. At the city level, city councils are the obvious example. These are the state code descriptions. The main one here to focus on that a lot of cities have tripped up on over the years is that bottom bullet point. Advisory board, commission, task force, there's a bunch of different names, committees, subcommittees. of the city government appointed by the council and or mayor and tasked with making recommendations on public policy issues. So nearly every city appointed board is going to qualify, even if it's only one or two people. They still will qualify because of that second piece there. The P and Z, they definitely make policy recommendations, right? Utility board, park board, you name it. That's the whole purpose. They're studying something to do with city government and coming up with some kind of recommendation, policy proposal, funding proposal, you name it. That's what they're intended to do. So all of them are going to be considered a governmental body. The other one that trips up cities a lot are subcommittees of the council or subcommittees of these different boards and commissions. The vast majority of those are also going to be governmental bodies in their state code because, again, their intent is to make public policy recommendations. Any questions there?
So if it's a subcommittee of the council, but there's not a quorum of council members, is that still considered?
Most likely, yes. This is the trickiest one probably of all. There was a court case involving Mason City 6 or 7 years ago or so, where they have a 7-member council in that community. And they had, I think, 3 members appointed to a budget committee, another 3 members appointed to a budget committee. To be perfectly blunt, I think it was to have really tough budget discussions about maybe cutting some services or staff levels. And they didn't want to do it in a public forum until they really had to make their budget decisions, the annual budget. They were contested on that because of this law. And actually the Iowa Public Information Board ruled in favor of the city because they didn't ever formally make a recommendation to the full council. They just basically broke into 2 groups of 3, studied the budget proposals, and then just came back to the council, and that was it.
So in that particular case, they're really trying to circumvent law by having 2 separate boards that did not make the recommendation. But if you truly had with non-malicious intent, the sub group of the council working on this particular, and they do make a recommendation formally to the entire council later on, is that?
That's where I think you might run into some issues though, because if you do make a formal recommendation, that's where that public policy definition kicks in. So I think Mason City survived because neither one of those groups ever made like a formal public proposal, like policy proposal. They just studied the budget quietly on their own time. And so that's the trick. It's definitely gray. And I know a lot of cities, a lot of our members have subcommittees of the council to study, like personnel committees are very common, where they'll have like 2 council members just really dive into policy, personnel issues, hiring issues, wage issues, whatever it may be. And, you know, they don't maybe ever make a recommendation to the council. They're just kind of really into personnel matters. They're probably fine, but my caution is always like, just be mindful of this. And if you have like a mayor and council that's like always has a standing subcommittee or several subcommittees, and they're expected to like come back with some kind of report, some kind of recommendation to the full council, it's probably best to treat them as a governmental body, even if it's only like 2 members. Which I know, I mean, I hate. It's one of the hardest parts about doing this presentation because I know it's like, now I'm just adding more work to everyone's plate by doing that, but it's better to be in compliance of the law. All right, so this is a list. We kind of run through a lot of these, but there's all kinds of boards and commissions out there. These are probably the most common ones that we see, but there's even more depending on the city. For any of your meetings, whether you're council, P and Z, you have to provide notice, at least 24 hours at a time with the notice of the meeting and a tentative agenda. And really the word tentative should probably be stricken from the state code because the agenda you post is it. You can modify your agenda up until that 24 hours time. You can have a revised agenda that happens on occasion. But once the 24-hour window hits, that's it. You cannot change anything on that agenda. The only thing you can do with the agenda is table items or remove items or reorder the items, I suppose. The biggest thing you cannot do after 24 hours is add anything to the agenda. That's a big no-no. It's another common mistake that cities make because it's out of innocence. Because you forget something and you realize, oh my gosh, we really got to approve that building permit. Forgot to have it on the agenda. Well, I hate to tell you, but it's too late if it's within 24 hours. So you got to work on that. Be mindful of that law. It's a really important one. The agenda itself needs to be posted at a prominent place. That's been interpreted to mean the meeting place. So City Hall, of course, for most cities out there is where they hold most of their meetings, City Council, P&Z, Board of Adjustment, whatever it may be. But if you meet elsewhere, like at the rec department for a park board meeting, something like that, that's fine. That's where the agenda should be posted. Time, date, and place, of course. The agenda itself needs to have the items that you plan to discuss and or vote on. We'll get into some best practices on that later. There is one little emergency clause in there where you can have a meeting without 24 hours notice, or you can add an item without 24 hours notice. We call this the emergency clause. The big caution there is it better be a true emergency. And it better not be that building permit example. The more common one I get from city clerks is we forgot to add a liquor license approval to the agenda. The bar will not be able to sell liquor in a few days if we don't approve this. Obviously, it's an emergency for some people, but it's probably not a true emergency. Cannot have a meeting or add that item to the agenda just for that. So that being said, you can always, there's no limitations on how often you meet. So my solution in those scenarios is have a special council meeting or have a special board meeting. I know it's one more night away, but it can be one item, vote, and get out. You know, it can be a 5-minute meeting if that's what you need to do. But otherwise, it really has to be a true emergency to violate that law. Every meeting needs to be done in open session, open to the public, accessible to the public. Reasonable access has a few caveats there. Obviously, a public building, a city building that people can access, and at a time it's accessible. There was a city not far from here, actually, years ago, that held a meeting at, I think it was 6 a.m. on a Sunday, maybe Saturday, it's a weekend. And they got in a little trouble for it. They didn't get really dinged, but it was basically said that the guidance from Iowa Public Information Board was that's likely not reasonably accessible to the public. And I probably would agree with them. Like 6 a.m. on a weekend is pretty tough, and on any day. I wouldn't try that if I were you, but of course, most cities, all of their meetings are in the evening, like at this time of night, at buildings like this. So it's pretty easy to comply. Every city, every governmental body has to take minutes of their meetings. There's a couple of catches here. For city council meetings, you have to publish the minutes within 15 days of the meeting. Okay. For all the boards and commissions, you also have to take minutes, but you do not have to publish. So that's an important distinction there. You can choose to publish those minutes from your P&Z and your utility boards and whatnot. That's your choice, not required to. What most cities I see do with the boards and commissions is, of course, take the minutes and then have them available at City Hall in case anybody wants to see them, perhaps post them on the city web pages. So they're up there for anyone to see. Those are good choices. But the state code says you just have to have them. Okay. The council, those are different. Those have to be published within 15 days. The minutes are fairly basic. Obviously, the votes are the most important thing. You got to know time, date, and place, who was present from the board or the council. For councils, they also have to list the claims and receipts is what the state code says. It's the bills and revenues, which can be summarized, but they also have to be at least monthly included in a set of minutes. That does not pertain to boards and commissions. You can, if you have, not a lot of city boards and commissions have a budget. Some do. So you can choose to put in budgetary information in those minutes if you want to. I don't see that very often, but you can. But again, the council minutes have to include the claims and receipts at least once a month. Any questions there? Okay. Oh shoot, I should have brought my updated slides. I forgot that Jackie wanted me to talk about closed sessions in particular. In our normal presentation, I have about 4 slides on closed sessions, and I'll do it hopefully from memory. Section 21.5 of the state code allows governmental bodies to go to closed session. Okay. There's, I think, 8 allowed purposes under that section, 3 of which are probably most used by cities. There's a few others that have nothing to do with city government. That would be to go in to discuss litigation strategy with your attorney, to discuss employee performance reviews at the employee's request. That's the only one. You have kind of a two-step process. The employee has to request that closed session in order for the council or the board to use it. And then the third most common one would be to discuss the potential purchase or sale of real estate. Okay. So those are the three most common ways or common uses of a closed session for city governments. Anytime that you're considering that, we recommend getting your city attorney to issue an opinion, even if you're very sure it's a lawful reason to use a closed session. Having that emailed opinion or written opinion to you is a nice defense in case somebody tries to contest your use of a closed session. This is the recommendation, not required, but it's a good idea. You have to have it on the agenda. You have to cite that specific state code subsection. So the one for using employee performance reviews is Iowa Code section 21.51I. Okay, you have to cite that and give the general reason to discuss employee performance. There's actually a longer verbiage in the state code, but that's enough. You don't have to give the name of the person or even the name of the position. You do have to give the general reason for why the council or the board is going to close session. Okay, same with like real estate. You don't have to identify the address you're thinking about purchasing or selling. You just have to say to discuss the potential sale or purchase of real estate. That needs to be on the agenda. Okay, when you get to the meeting itself, the board or the council has to vote to use a closed session. That vote has to be approved by at least 2/3 of the members. Okay, so it's a supermajority that's needed. Assuming that happens, you can go into closed session. Okay, at that point, the only people who have a lawful right to be in that closed session are the elected officials or the appointed board members themselves. They can invite in whoever else they think is necessary to that. So if you're doing an employee performance review, it's very common that employee would be asked to come in at some point to take part in the review of their performance. If you're doing litigation, you got to bring in your attorney. So those are some obviously valid reasons to bring in an outside person, so to speak. A lot of cities will have the city manager and or city clerk present because here's another requirement you have. You have to take an audio recording and minutes of every closed session. And that audio recording and the minutes have to be, what the state code says sealed, have to be placed in a sealed envelope. It's kind of old school language. Nowadays, most people have digital recordings and digital minutes. So you have to place those digital files in a sealed, protected file somewhere. Okay, has to be kept for at least 1 year. After 1 year, the city can destroy the recording in the minutes if it so chooses. Most attorneys will tell you to destroy that because as long as you possess it, it's an exposure for the city government. And someone could get their hands on it that probably shouldn't have it, potentially. So those are some of the basics under the state code.
So when you say it has to be stored, sealed, is there a location that has to be done? Like, I'm assuming my bedroom
Right.
doesn't, or like a drawer in my house isn't a.
Right, or a personal laptop if you have a digital file. Right. You want it to be on a city-owned and operated machine or file cabinet if you're using paper minutes and like a cassette tape or something like that. Usually the city clerk in most cities will help with that, the city manager, city attorney. I don't know how you guys kind of task out your board and commissions. Cities this size tend to task out who's a city staff member who's kind of in charge of P&Z or who's helping with, I'm guessing with like Parks and Rec. Yep. So that person may be, but usually the city clerk's office is the lawful custodian of records for the city government. And not to get into an open records kind of presentation, because I have one of those too. But that's usually who manages all of the city's records. And so that's usually who it gets funneled to make sure it's in a safe, protected place with the other confidential records the city has to maintain.
And for digital files or so forth that are password protected, who has those passwords? Who
Same
keeps those?
process. Usually the city clerk and or city manager would be in charge of that for most cities. I mean, it should be identified, but you really want to limit like who has access because these are required by the state code to be sealed. And so you really can't flaunt that. Obviously with stuff like this, it's just human nature. If you have too many people that have copies and recordings of a closed session, and then somebody oops it and sends that file instead of that file and attaches it to an email to somebody, and now it's out to the public. And then you violated the state code. So the best process is identifying one or two people, like, again, typically the city clerk and city manager. For most cities this size would be in charge of that. They may not be there physically to do the recording, and I would trust someone from the board to do that, but it should get to them for safekeeping. Does that make sense? Sorry, I'm not trying to add any work processes to your city operations here, but that's generally what we see as a best practice.
Can someone from the public come and request that information?
From a closed session?
Closed session?
No, well, they can request it, but you would have to deny it and cite the state code. It's why. The only thing, so the state code does identify the district court can order those to be opened. The state ombudsman's office and the Iowa Public Information Board. So it is, I don't think it's happened in my time at the League of Cities, maybe once, involving litigation. Once it got settled, I think a judge ordered it to be open, the proceedings of a closed session. But that's it. The city has no choice. It's not, you would just tell the citizen, we're required by state code to keep this sealed.
Mickey, what are the limitations on the individuals that are taking part in that closed session as far as information that is disclosed to anybody else outside of the meeting? Not like that.
Yeah, so this was like, so like, I'm trying to, I wish I forget, sorry, I didn't send you updated slides. There is a slide I have that gets into like the best practices. And this is certainly one of the things that I stress, because in my time at the league, most cities do a pretty good job of the mechanics of following the state code, recording the things and keeping them closed off. The bigger issues that have occurred have been a member who was present to that closed session, going down to the local tap or going to their neighborhood listening post, if you will, and sharing the contents of what was discussed inside that closed session. The Iowa Public Information Board has yet, they want to strengthen the state code of Iowa to consider that to be a misdemeanor, similar to other misdemeanors when you break the open meetings law, potentially. I think the state code of Iowa has enough in it right now that they could pursue that against somebody, but the Iowa Public Information Board, and I keep referring to them, they're the state agency that's the open meetings and open records oversight watchdog at the state level. And I think they would have enough to go on it, but they want to strengthen that because there have been multiple issues, not just with cities, counties and schools too, where somebody goes out and shares the closed session discussion. That is a violation of the open meetings law, flat out. So never do that. And I've said this, I mean, kiddingly, but like, again, going back to some of our smaller cities that have a husband and wife on the council together, or brothers and sisters and all this. And it's like, naturally, they're going to go home and talk about everything, but don't talk about it in front of somebody, even a family member that doesn't have the right to know what happened in that closed session. And it can be hard, I get it, but you cannot share that. You just cannot share what happened inside of a closed session with anyone who doesn't have the right.
And so conversation could be with somebody who was in that closed session. Those would really be the only people you could actually talk about what happened in the closed session. Anybody outside of that, even though they may be on another board,
Yeah.
you're not allowed to do that.
That's right. Yeah, and I know that's tough in city government because things overlap with one another, and you feel like they should know, but it's like, I'm sorry, I just can't tell you. And that's the only response you can have. And I know it's hard at the staff level too. You know, I worked for a city and they would have closed sessions and I wasn't involved. You know, I was a little grunt, and that's just I wasn't at that pay grade. As simple as that. And of course I wanted to know what was going on, but no one was going to share that with me. And that's fine. You have to learn to live with it. So yeah, it's just something that a city attorney certainly stress. Whatever happens in that closed session, it's got to stay with that group. And that's it. Now, ultimately, a lot of times a closed session will lead to a council decision. Like you'll do with that real estate transaction at some point. So you may not hear all the nuts and bolts of what that discussion, but the public will see the decision that came out of that closed session. That's another point I always make. You cannot vote. You cannot formally vote inside a closed session. You can certainly discuss the relevant matter, and you can only discuss that relevant matter, by the way. You cannot use a closed session to start spinning it off into some other thing. It has to be on that particular topic. But you can discuss it. You can arrive at a consensus or arrive at a majority vote, but you cannot formally vote. All formal votes have to happen in open session. So what you do is you discuss your thing, whatever you're in closed session for, chat it out, whatever it is about. Sometimes it can take a very long time, but you return to open session, you close that closed session. The mayor or the presiding officer of the board will say, we're returned to open session now. And the next item on the agenda often is something that's relevant to that closed session, and you hold your vote on it. Purchase the real estate, whatever it is.
But clearly, if, for example, the council gives direction and something happens that action needs to be taken, staff can operate within those recommendations and then bring it back formally to the council.
Right. Yep. And this just came up the other day. I was talking to a city where they had a closed session on an employee performance review. And it was a good one. It was like, it wasn't anything nasty, but the employee requested the closed session and it had a good review, but the city had nothing on the agenda afterward. But through that conversation, they realized they wanted to give a wage increase to this employee. They felt like the person had earned it, which is great, but it wasn't on the agenda. And so they wanted to vote on it right away. And the concern was that's not appropriate, which is not, because it wasn't on the agenda. So the staff basically knows what's next, but formally the vote has to occur at the next meeting. So that's probably an example of if you know, like, okay, we're going to discuss this in closed session and the council's going to be ready to vote, put it on the agenda. If the council's not ready to vote or the board's not ready to vote, just leave it off the agenda, sit on it, and then bring it back to the next meeting.
Thank you. A couple clarifications on the property transaction closed session. Those records do become public after the transaction happens for 1 year.
That's right.
And then also, I know the open meetings law allows for, and this mainly pertains to the council or maybe you too if they have meetings, but there is an exception to the open meetings rules for discussing union negotiations. So you don't have to comply with union laws because when you're discussing unions. But when you're talking general employee benefits and things like that, you cannot go into closed session.
That's right. This is another tricky part. There's a specific state code section that Andy's talking about that allows collective bargaining negotiations to occur in a private setting. That only pertains to collective bargaining units and employees affected by that. General discussions about wages, benefits, employment conditions have to occur in open session. It's a little tricky. So again, there is one for specific employee performance reviews, but that has to be just about that employee. If you cannot let that closed session turn into, we should give all staff members a 7% wage increase. No, only that employee gets to be discussed during that closed session.
And the employee has to.
And in that case, that type of closed session, the employee has to request it. Yes, sorry, sir.
If a board or commission receives written comments, do they have to be included in the minutes?
That's your choice. So the question is about, in case the folks on Zoom, I should have been repeating these all along. If a city board or commission or council receives written comments ahead of a meeting, which is fairly common, do they have to be included in the minutes? Not required by the state code. And in fact, it's not required by the state code for the minutes to include the discussion of the meeting itself, or when a public member of the public makes some kind of statement at a meeting in person or on Zoom for that matter. You can if you want to. Most cities do, but you don't have to. The minutes themselves only have to really be those basic things: the votes taken, the bills paid, the time, date, and place, the members present. That's really only the thing the state code requires. But I think as a best practice, most cities would include at least a summary of those discussions and public comments, things like that. It's tough because someone may get, some night you may have a controversial item on the agenda. You may get 25 comments ahead of time and another 20 in person. Your minutes suddenly are 50 pages in length. And that's where there's kind of a, it's gonna be expensive for the city to publish if it was a council meeting. But again, boards and commissions, you don't have to publish your minutes if you don't want to.
Can you clarify for civil service commission, when they're doing interviews, do they have to, in the session, do they have to get requested by the person?
Okay.
Not required for civil service to go into closed session, it's automatically closed?
I wish I could pull up chapter 400 real quick. Civil service is also unique. I don't remember off the top of my head. I'm sure it's in chapter 400 somewhere. I feel like they do also have a special privilege.
That's what I thought.
I'm pretty sure they do, but I don't want to say that definitively because it's been a while since I dived into that code. But yeah, remind me, I can look it up later. Yeah.
So when you were talking about salaries, like broad, if you're talking about a large group of individuals or even more than one individual talking about salary increases or something, but you're not, that's has to be public.
Yeah. So there's the one closed session that you can talk about employee performance review is about that one employee, and that person has to request it. The employee has to request it. You can also use that one for doing employee interviews. If there's an open position and the person requests a closed session to conduct that interview, you can use that for that type of discussion as well. The caution though is you cannot use the closed session to talk about general employment conditions or wages that affect the entire workforce or an entire city department, like police department or public works department, something like that. Because that's not specifically about that employee's performance. That's about a whole group of employees at that point. So that's the difference between the two. Does that make sense? Kinda, yeah. The state code is quirky, is all get out. Of course it is.
Lawyers wrote it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so just the biggest line in the sand though is just remember that particular one is about employee performance review for one person. Just remember that there's the differences between one person discussing one person's performance and a whole group. The whole group discussion has to be done in open session.
Sure.
That's how I always look at it. These are all great questions and keep them coming. I am going to move next into more of like the best practices on having good meetings. I always start with the bad side of things, with the symptoms of a bad meeting. And we've done this presentation for numerous communities. Maybe not even that they're having bad meetings, but perhaps they're feeling like things are getting there and they want to head it off, and which is smart. You want to be proactive because believe me, there's cities all around Iowa that were not proactive and they are struggling. And those are usually the people that call the League of Cities the most. And we call them our frequent flyers, which is fine. That's what we're there for. But it is painful to listen to it because a lot of it just comes down to they don't have good rules. They don't have good procedures for getting through a meeting effectively. And they get bogged down in kind of the stuff that shouldn't happen. So what does it look like? What does it sound like? That's what I always what does it sound like? What does it feel like? I think most of us have probably been to a bad public meeting where people are shouting at one another, talking over one another, being disrespectful. The worst case scenarios I've been involved. People are making threats of violence. None of that can be taken lightly, especially that last piece these days in particular. So you want to, again, be proactive, be mindful of it. It's not to say every time you have a little discussion or disagreement that's bad, that's a bad symptom or something you got to be careful or worried about. Of course, there's going to be disagreements. There should be disagreements, frankly. That's, you got a lot of different types of people in this room right here. Not everyone's going to see the world the same way. And that's great. You got to respect that. But you got to avoid the name calling, the being disrespectful, the talking over one another. So how do you do that is the question. But before we get there, why do we do it? We have rules for a good reason. Why you want to have effective, efficient meetings. If for nothing else, you're not here till midnight. The meetings that are done poorly, where there's lots of chatter and just back talk and all that, most of it's because people just talk endlessly, and there's no one stopping them and enforcing the rules. And you look up and you've been sitting there for 4 hours, and people get tired. When people get tired, they lose their temper. It's pretty simple psychology. So you got to avoid it. But the meetings are helpful for the participants. Obviously, that's the main purpose of this, but they can also help citizens. Sometimes citizens are at the heart of the issue. Sometimes media can be a problem, interjecting themselves when they shouldn't, and asking questions when it's not their time to ask questions, and upsetting the flow of the meeting. So having a basic set of rules will help everybody. And a lot of times what you'll see nowadays is having some kind of one-sheeter, one-pager sitting out, and you can have it ready They just give the basic rules. They can hand it out to citizens, hand it out to the media, council members, board members, just to say, okay, these are the rules that we follow. Okay, especially for citizens, like there's a hot issue that they're really passionate about. We'll get to you. Just here's when we get to you. Okay, let them know up front so they don't get all stirred up. To emphasize that the state code, now this gets into councils, but this definitely pertains to your boards and commissions too. The state code of Iowa supports this. And recently there's been, I've had to emphasize this slide and this slide because there's two different parts of the state code that talk about your ability to set rules for your meetings. The 21.7, going back, is the main one. And the biggest key here is to keep your meetings free of interruption and interference. Okay, so the state code of Iowa is allowing you to set rules to keep your meetings free of interruption and interference. It does say that, I'm sorry, somewhere else in that state code, that same code section, citizens can record your open meetings. I hope you're all aware of that. Any governmental body, any meeting that you have, a citizen can record it. But again, you can have rules that keep it from free of interruption and free of interference. It's important at all times, but lately a lot of cities have been getting hit up with these First Amendment audits, Fourth Amendment audits. And one of the things that people take this approach of like First Amendment, you can't tell me to stop talking. Like, well, yes and no. Yeah, you get to say things that you think are important to you or something you want to express yourself, but you got to do it within the construct of our meeting. The state code of Iowa allows us to do that. Okay. So it's kind of a yin and yang there. This doubles down. There's another code subsection there that says councils get to set meetings for their the rules for their meetings, and again, your boards and commissions should as well. Most of these don't have to be very extensive. There are some city councils, city governments that have whole books, bound books that govern their meetings. In general, that's fine, but a lot of cities it's probably just a 2 or 3 page thing. It's very common sense, very basic, but again, it's very necessary when, especially when you may not know it, but here comes somebody that's going to really ruin your meeting or try to ruin your meeting. You need to fall back on something. Some basics to include: regular meeting schedules. Do not overlook this. This is something, again, I just cited that city earlier today that wasn't able to meet. Make sure, especially new board members, new council members, know the basics of a quorum, how important it is for them to attend the meetings. We may need you for a quorum in order to actually do business. That's kind of a basic thing. So set a meeting schedule that works well. For city councils, most of them have kind of a basic thing of like the first and third Mondays of the month, something like that. But even so, the councils out there have to look out for holidays, other important days of the year, like a town festival. You don't want to obviously conflict with yourself on something like that. And so you may have to reschedule some meetings along the way, which is fine. But just be mindful of it. So it's not a surprise the day before you're supposed to have a meeting. Again, as I said before, you can meet as often as you like. So you always have the ability to call for special meetings or work sessions. A lot of cities use those, and that's great. But who gets to call those? How are those called? That's where things can get tricky. Okay, so who has the power to do that? Some
You have to have
cities.
24 hours notice prior to a meeting.
That's right.
So it's not just like.
That's right. So you still have to provide 24 hours notice. And in some cities, for a city council to have a special meeting, they would require the mayor to call it. Okay, so what if the mayor calls a meeting, but a quorum of the council doesn't agree with the mayor to have a meeting, to have an extra meeting? You're not going to have a meeting at that point, are you? So you can identify who's in charge of that. You probably should, but you're likely going to rely on city staff to get that scheduled, to find a time and date that works for the group to get a quorum together. So build that into your process. Try to give yourself enough time for when you need to have a special meeting.
Rule on how quickly you can, like how late you can cancel.
There's no rule in the state code on canceling a meeting at all, like how soon or how late you can do it. And so going back to just earlier today, the city was worried about that and said, well, just get notice out as quick as you can. That's my only guidance there. It's just post a notice at the meeting place, take down the agenda or tape over the agenda and say, meeting's been canceled due to XYZ reason. If you know the rescheduled date, that's best. So then you can quickly post that and say, meeting will be held next Monday instead of this week, something like that. So just try to get the notice out as quick as you possibly can. That's it. Yeah. Good question. Okay, so the agenda is probably the area we have the most consternation among our own members because it's a power struggle. I'll just identify the issue. It's a power struggle. Often council's the more where it's more visible, but it can certainly happen with P&Z and Board of Adjustment, any of the boards and commissions on who has the ability to set the agenda, add the items, and then just as importantly, who has the ability to take them off. This is crucial for everyone to understand. The best practice that I've seen, I'm going to go back to the council level, is that the mayor and council equally have the ability to add items, and then the staff is leaned on to help shape it. Most elected officials, all due respect to you, but you probably don't know all the bills that have to be paid, all the permits that need to be approved, maybe even some contracts that have to be agreed to by the city, because these are kind of technical routine things that the staff has to be aware of. That's their job. That being said, it's a team process. It really needs to be a team process. Just keep in mind this, but at the city council level, only the council itself can approve the agenda or remove an item from the agenda or table an item from the agenda. So the mayor has a big part in it and kind of being the presiding officer of the council. But ultimately it's the council has the power to, again, vote on the agenda itself. For boards and commissions, same deal. Who has the ability to set that agenda? It's going to be a group effort. Again, you're probably going to rely on whatever staff helper that you have to come up with the issues or be aware of the issues that you need to be talking about and worried about and voting on. P&Z is a more classic example where you got zoning requests and things like that. So that's what's going to formulate your agenda. So just be aware of who has that power. If I have a citizen approach me and says, the city's got to do something about that street down in my neighborhood, where do I go? Do I go to the mayor? Do I go to the city manager? Do I go to the rec superintendent, the public works director, right? What is that process? So that needs to be identified in your rules. Sorry, go ahead.
So if you're sending an email asking for agenda items, you violate that when people are responding to you with agenda items? Are you taking the open meeting thing?
Potentially, it's a great question. And it's one of the, seemingly trivial parts of all this, but ends up being kind of important. So every city is a little bit different. I would say the best process is usually the mayor and council individually will notify like the clerk and or city manager, especially at the council level. This is what I want on the agenda, right? Whatever it is. But the same would be true of any park board or zoning commission, anything like that. Just to use that city staff member as sort of the hub. But that conversation should be one-on-one with that person. And then that person, the staff member, would start formulating the agenda based on the various things they're hearing from the council or the board members. And then at some point say, this is what I've got. Okay. There's actually, you're good at getting me to my next slide. So this is where the more the kind of behind the scenes things you got to work out. What is expected of the staff? Ultimately, you're working backwards from that 24-hour shot clock, right? But most cities try to get their agendas and meeting packets, meeting materials, whatever you have, out at least 72 hours. That's kind of the best practice, I would say. So most cities meet on Mondays, councils that is, meet on Mondays. They try to get everything out on Friday at the latest, really. So everyone has some time. The council has some time to do some homework over the weekend. The public, of course, and the media have a chance to see everything, read through whatever they want to read through. So the staff has to work even further back than that to get everything ready, because it's not just the agenda. For the council level, the meeting packets can be huge. All the supporting documents that go into that. Maybe not quite as much with like P&Z and utility boards, but it depends on, something. This is a big utility here in town. So their packets are pretty big. So that's a lot of work. So you got to have the behind the scenes rules set as well. So you're telling your staff what you need from them so they can do their job to set you up for success.
I guess maybe ask you to clarify, so like our committee, maybe some, what was your hometown pride? And maybe like the arts commission where maybe the mayor and council are not involved in that.
Right. Yeah, so the open meetings laws will still apply, assuming they're appointed by the city council, so that they would still need to follow all of this. Now, in those cases, it's probably less of like, I would say, a time commitment for staff. There's probably not as many supporting documents and materials that they need for their meetings. Not to minimize anything that they're doing, but it's just less items on an agenda. So it's probably a little bit less of a formal process that's needed to get everything ready and done. That being said, you'd still have to be careful to not use like email to have like the whole hometown pride committee. Like, should we have this agenda? Should we have that agenda? I mean, you're basically deliberating on city business by doing that. That's the worry I would have. So that's where having that one staff member or one person be the focal point, be the person that's kind of gathering all the ideas and just having one-on-one conversations from the other board members to avoid the open meetings laws concerns, but still get your agenda ready.
You know, you can have something on your agenda that says you're going to discuss what's going to be on this agenda next week too. Kind of pre-plan that.
Yeah, so this is another point, I think it might be later on, but councils don't do this as much, but definitely the boards and commissions, because they don't meet as regularly as the city council does. So they often will have an agenda item. This is good practice, that somewhere at the end to say like next items or items for the future, and just say, here are 3, 4, 5 things that we really got to bring back next time. So that gives you a start on the next agenda, because you might only meet once every 2 months or something like that, which is fine. But the problem with that is it's a long time in between. You start to forget things. What did we discuss last time? What did we vote on last time? Which is understandable. But yeah, that's a way to kind of know, like, we know these 3 things have to be in the next agenda. Okay, now, are you guys still using Robert's Rules of Order in Indianola? Huh? Maybe vaguely. Most cities used to use this in Iowa. Is everyone somewhat familiar with Robert's Rules of Order? It's like old English parliamentary procedure. If you're still using that, shame on you. That's what I would say. Yeah. I mean, there still are some cities that do, and I'm always like, wow. I want to attend those meetings just to get a glimpse of the past. Most cities have gotten away from them. They are very cumbersome. There's so many like votes to have a vote. It's kind of crazy. You don't need to do that. And so most cities have very simplified rules when it comes into like the order of the business, the voting and so forth. But just have something that says, okay, here's how our meeting's supposed to go. Here's when we call for a vote. Here's when we call for a discussion. So these next few slides, we'll get into that. But do that again, the basics, don't forget the basics. Are you going to start your meeting with some kind of invocation? You're going to prayer, the Pledge of Allegiance is common, of course. So whatever it is, make sure people are aware this is how we start our meetings. Don't surprise anybody. At some point, though, of course, you're going to call to order the meeting itself. For the city councils, the mayor is the presiding officer of the council. That is under the state code of Iowa. So that is the mayor, and most of our cities cannot vote. We'll get into voting later, but they are the presiding officer of the council. So that is an important duty. For your boards and commissions, do you have like a chairperson picked from within the group? That's probably the most typical thing. So they would be the presiding officer for that board or commission. So they would be the person that calls the meeting to order and gets things started. For councils especially, the next item is typically a consent agenda where you can wrap up a bunch of those routine items like bills and permits and licenses all in one item and one vote. Speeds things way up, things that are non-controversial, the council's going to vote for, and it's all done in one swell swoop. That being said, you can remove items from the consent agenda. If a particular council member has an issue with a certain bill that is on the proposed list, you can ask to have that yanked off. The agenda can agree, or the council can agree to have the agenda changed, or they can say, nope, we like the consent agenda as it is, we vote for it, 4-1, we're done, moving on. but you can remove items from the consent agenda. So the next things, I guess, is mainly for councils, but I know other boards and commissions have hearings, especially P and Z. Public hearings, how are those handled? Most cities put those at near the top of the agenda. And why is that? If someone from the public is there because at the meeting, because they are there for the public hearing, you want them sitting around for a half hour or an hour, you know, getting a little agitated, getting a little sweaty? No, I would say not. I think most cities would say, let's let them get right to it. Okay, so public hearings are usually in there right early on, and actually I have this a bit out of order on my slide, but most cities would also have public comments at the top, near the top of the meeting. And I don't know if your boards and commissions get a ton of public comments, maybe they do. Some city councils, they may go months without having a single citizen attend their meetings, but all it takes is one controversial issue and half the town is showing up. So you gotta be ready for it. So have a rule on it. We'll get to that here in a little bit. But in terms of the order of business, again, same thought process. If somebody's there, not from the city, they're probably there. It's usually not to pat you on the back. It's usually because they're upset about something. Let them have their piece, get it off their chest. They'll probably even leave right after that. In my experience, they usually just take right off after they said their thing, and now it's done. Okay, and then they're not sitting there getting all antsy and making gestures and all that. Ordinances, resolutions, motions. These are the types of voting actions. We'll cover that here a little bit, but usually those are organized in a certain way. The last thing here with agendas. In my personal opinion, the league's opinion, simply labeling things as old business and new business is not sufficient. Your agenda items need to specifically identify what you plan to vote upon and or discuss. Some cities, it's a good idea in my opinion, to say a discussion item only or action item, voting item, something like that. Resolution number blank to approve contract to repay First Avenue, right? Ordinance number blank to raise utility rates, sorry. Right, identify specifically what you're doing. Even if it's a discussion only item, discussing the potential aquatic center, new aquatic center for the community. Identify the specific thing, okay? You can categorize things by old business and new business, but I still see some cities have agenda items where it just says literally like at the bottom, new business, like an open-ended free range discussion on whatever comes to mind. Like, no, that's not gonna cut it. That's not gonna cut it. You gotta inform the public what you plan to discuss and take action on. Okay.
You probably shouldn't have an
Other
at the end here.
The only thing that I think is okay is that a lot of cities, councils, again, for that example, they'll have like a mayor's comments, mayor and council comments. And that's usually just like, the mayor may belong to a certain club or a committee, like the emergency management committee, and they'll want a chance to give like a minute report on what happened at the last meeting. Or a council member may belong to a social club in town that's doing some kind of public project. They want to get enough. That's fine, because it's not really city business. It's not really like deliberating on city business. But that's the big key there. Do not use that like other comment time to really get into like a city topic. That's the big catch. Like if you use that, the mayor says something like, and we really ought to build a new pool. And then the council spends a half an hour talking about the new pool. Now you violated state code. That's the trouble that I see.
So Mickey, is there a difference between a resolution and a motion?
Yes, and hold that thought because there is a slide at the end where I talk about voting items themselves. Typically, the presiding officer for the council is the mayor. You have a chairperson for your boards. Their main job, of course, is to run you through the agenda, announce the items. Then they'll call for discussion at some point. Typically, they'll say, here's the item number 7, council discussion or board discussion. And a lot of cities have like a free reign on that, which is fine for most cities. Some cities have a rule that stipulates that you have to be recognized to speak. And that's usually done when they have council members or board members that dominate the conversation. So you got to be careful with that, like having the free open time, because if you have one council member or one board member who just talks incessantly, even if it's very positive and they're very thoughtful and eloquent, at some point you need to let other people speak. You got to have the ability to say, okay, you've had your time. Let's move. Have somebody else have a chance. You can't filibuster the meeting, essentially. So you may need to have some time limits on discussion. The big thing, though, is no interruptions. This is probably the area that causes the most trouble. Everything's going fine. Mayor or the board chair announces the item, calls for discussion, and then all hell breaks loose. It just shouting and and this just goes on and on and on and on and on. Interruptions from the public, interruptions from the council, back and forth, and that's just totally unproductive, totally unprofessional. You don't have to stand for that. And in fact, you shouldn't. You should have rules that prevent that. And if somebody does go over line, you call the meeting to order, gavel it, whatever it takes, get it back to business. Okay. So this gets into the same thought there, limiting remarks to a reasonable length. What is reasonable? That's for you all to decide. 5 minutes per council member per item. I've seen that. I've seen no rules at all, which is risky, but that's fine. It's your choice. But I think you have to have the ability for the presiding officer to say, okay, you've spoken long enough. Does anybody else have something to say? Okay. I mean, it's not Congress. You don't have to do the whole thing where I cede my time to the good gentleman from Indianola. Like, you can, but you don't have to. But at some point, you got to close the debate, right? At some point, we're not going to be here all night. The presiding officer has to say, that's it, discussion's closed. And if it's a voting item, you say, I call for a vote, right? Is there a motion on the floor? Something like that.
What about if it's a group of 5 and the presiding officer disagrees with the other 4?
Yeah.
And they're just closing it just because they don't want to.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you go about that? Like, where the person who's presiding is the one who's disagreeing with everybody else.
Name a different chair. That is the hardest one of all for at the city, at the board level, not for the public so much, but at like the board or council level, because especially for the councils, because the mayor under state code of Iowa is the presiding officer. You can't change that. I would say at that point, you have to go back into the rules themselves if you're a city council and say, Mr. Mayor or Miss Mayor, you're not following our own rules. You're not allowing for discussion the way our rules allow for discussion. So it may be a rule problem if somebody's cutting off discussion prematurely. That's how I would address it. So at the board and commission levels, not quite as cut and dried on who's got those powers, but you could certainly, I mean, honestly, no joking, you could change chair. I mean, you could put that item on the next agenda and be like, you're lousy at this. You're not allowing us to speak when it's clearly our time to speak. You're done.
Yeah.
And then you see how you like it when you're one of us, it's tit for tat, but more professional, of course, would be just to have a chat about it, to say, look, we have rules here. And I don't know if you have rules to that effect, maybe you need some that say you call for discussion and you allow up to 5 minutes per person, whatever you want to come up with. And then that ensures that you have a rule to cite in case someone is not allowing that to happen. That's the best way to go about it. I know that people, even when they know there's rules, they're going to be like, don't apply to me. Like, that's tough. That's where you have to get the city manager involved or the city attorney and say, we need some help. Public hearings real quick. You have to schedule these out as necessary. City councils are fairly regular, fairly common. Boards and commissions, not so much. You have to publish a notice for these. The standard is 4 to 20 days prior to the hearing. For zoning, it's 7 to 20 days. So it's a little bit different there. For the city budget process, there's 2 different hearings you have to have. It's 10 to 20 days. Why the state code of Iowa has different publishing timeframes is beyond everyone. It's stupid and dumb, but that's what we got. So getting back to the rules, though, you can have rules that regulate that the decorum, the length of time, and so on. Now, this is the only time that you're required as a governmental body to allow the public to speak. Most cities, of course, have public comments at their meetings, council meetings and board meetings, and that's a good idea. You should do it. And we'll talk about that next. But you're not required to. You're in fact not required to have a public comment time on your agenda. But the only time the public has a lawful right is a public hearing to speak. But even so, you can prevent them from being profane, doing name calling, any of that stuff. You can't put a stop to that. So this is citizen participation. This is probably the other source that really causes for the bad stuff that happens sometimes. Most of these have a public comment time. We'll talk about that next. But you can also allow the public to chime in whenever they want. I don't think that's the best idea. It's not the best practice to, I think, have just the public chime in and interrupt the council anytime they want. But I think some cities have found it advantageous to have at each agenda item, presiding officer announces it, the mayor announces it perhaps, and calls for council discussion, and then calls for public discussion. That's fine. If you want to run it as a more of a public forum, totally your choice. You just have to be aware that that could elongate the meetings, and it's your choice though. It's fine. You should have public participation. That's the one thing. I don't want you to come away from this meeting thinking, oh, we gotta curtail public comments. Like, no, that's not the point. The main point is making sure it's done in a thoughtful, planned out manner. So you can, again, have efficient meetings. Some cities will require the person to give their name and address or even sign a form. I personally don't really like all that. I don't want there to be a barrier from a member of the public, in my opinion, to come up and address their council. It can be pretty intimidating to be here to talk to the council, especially if I'm going to criticize something about the city. It takes a lot of guts, I think, to do that. And so I don't know if you really need to have that person's name and address. Some of you probably know them anyways. But I don't think having like a registry is all that important, but some cities do. So you can, but I don't think you can demand it. I don't think you can require them to give their name and address in order to give their public comments. You can request it, but I don't think you can demand.
Is public-
Do it, but we mainly do it to make sure they give the names of interest.
Yeah, well, yeah, so you can identify them properly. Yeah.
Is public, is it limited or is it defined, or could it be anybody? So we govern the city,
Yes.
but not always Warren County. Somebody came from the county to talk to the city. Is that part of public?
No, you can definitely bar non-Indianola resident. I'm joking. No, public is the public. As much as I know some cities would like to say, oh, you're from blank town. You're not a taxpayer here. You're not a resident here. Good night. There's the door. No, you can't. We've had, especially during the pandemic when a lot of cities were using Zoom, strangely enough, there was getting a lot of like snowbirds from Arizona and Florida calling into or zooming into council meetings. And like, I thought it was a good thing. It wasn't like they were just calling in to complain. But they're public, it could be anyone from anywhere, really. So no, it's a good question because I have had cities that are like a resident of like the unincorporated area that may use city services, like a library, will come to a meeting and really criticize something, and their thought was like, well, they're not even a resident of the city. I'm like, well, I understand, but they're a member of the public. They have a right to be there. They may not have a lot of, like, what they say may not carry as much weight as a person who lives inside city limits, but they still get to be there.
Yeah, we rarely have people come from the public into the meeting, so
Yeah,
it's not really an issue for us.
You can't have a time limit on these remarks, and you should, for the public comment time. 3 to 5 minutes is the most common. You can also do that in a way that's like on the same topic. There's been several cities, especially larger cities, where you get, Des Moines had this where like 100 residents showed up on the same topic and they're all going to say the same thing. And the council basically said, can you appoint like a chairperson of your group, and we'll give them some extra time, but not the full allotted time for each person. Otherwise, we're going to be here till tomorrow. And I think that's fair. So it just depends on each city, but I think having some kind of limitation is a good idea, just to, again, keep things going. You can't have a rule that says the remarks must be germane. What does that mean? You can say that your remarks have to be something to do with city government, our city government. As much as the Hawkeyes are important to you, we are not here to talk about Brian Ferentz and the terrible offense. We are here to talk about city government.
Tell us how you really feel.
I'm a diehard Hawk. It's been a rough year. But seriously, that's like, sometimes citizens, bless their heart, they don't maybe get that distinction that like national politics or sports or whatever is time to share their thoughts. Like, no, this is a city government meeting. We're here to discuss city business. And so you can let's tell them to get back on point if they're starting to go off the rails and get into something that has nothing to do with city government. In fact, you should have a rule to that effect. You can definitely, and you really must have a rule that gets into not allowing offensive remarks, profanity, name calling, the violence, anything like that. There's no time and place for that. Remember that state code supports that. Sometimes citizens don't understand that, again, that this is not just a, open mic night. You can be expected to behave yourself in a professional manner. The quorum can mean a lot of different things. You can obviously limit things to discussion on the specific items. You can have rules to keep things civil. You should. This definitely can not only mean the citizens, when you're talking about public comments, but the council members themselves. Sometimes it is the council members or board members who are the ones who need to be reined in and reminded to be professional and behave themselves properly. And ultimately, you can remove people from a public meeting. This is very, very rare. It has happened probably less than 10 times since I've been at the league that I'm aware of. But every now and then you see that happen because somebody just really repeatedly violates that rule and is causing real problems. Up to the point where you can even have criminal charges. This is exceedingly rare. I think there's 2 times that come to mind in the last maybe 5 or 10 years where this has happened, but it has happened. The thing is that you could have 100 great meetings in a row, but all it takes is that one. All it takes is that one. And if you're caught unaware, you may not be prepared then to handle it properly. So just, again, be aware of this stuff. Usually when you talk about like the removal of somebody or even citing them with a criminal charge, you've probably dealt with them a lot already. You've already given them the 3 strikes and you've warned them, you've given them the rules. The thing I would say to this, your attorneys would definitely tell you this, have all that ready as documented reasons for the removal of this person. Because we know the open meetings law allows them to have access. So this is tough to take a member of the public and take them away from a public meeting, but you can't. Okay. There are a couple state codes that you have in your back pocket in chapter 718 for the willful disturbance of public meetings, public official proceedings, I think is what it says in the state code. Again, very rare. Every now and then I'll talk to a city that has to have law enforcement stationed at a public meeting, a council meeting in particular. The smaller cities, that may be a county sheriff. In this city, of course, you have a police department. Happened when I was working for a city. It's ugly, it's not fun, but you just never know. So you got to be prepared to have some rules in place to help the mayor, the council, or the board members walk through it properly and stick to the plan. On the front end of all this, conduct orientations and trainings. I think I alluded to this before. When you have new board members, new council members, new committee members, give them that basic rules sheet, whatever you've got. The league has an open meetings desk reference, just a very simple 1-page thing that gives all this in a much more condensed fashion, not too overwhelming, I hope. Nice to have that just kind of ready, especially for those new folks who, most people, if they're brand new to city council or a city board or commission, they probably don't know any of this. It's not their fault. This stuff is only, it's only real to you until you're doing it. But when you're doing it, it becomes very important, as we all know. So do those orientation trainings and meetings, get people prepared so they can be at their best and not have to worry about violating laws. They can focus on the issues at hand. Couple more things we talked about meetings or voting. Real quick, motions are for routine, just kind of functions of the meeting or the business of the city. They use a motion vote to approve the consent agenda, a motion to do most like bills, a simple bill pays or things like that. Resolutions are policy statements of the city. Policy statements are typically for like, actual policies, employee policies, financial policies, but also contracts are considered policies. So you use a resolution for those types of things. Then ordinances are laws. Those are the city codes. Parking, traffic, utility rates. These are setting the law of the city. This is what we have to govern our city. Zoning, of course, is a huge part of that. So there's various things that would be in the city code, but those are all done through ordinances. Okay.
So we've done change orders, contract agreements, contractual resolutions, too, which include the laws.
Mhm.
So is that, I'm assuming many cities do that, is that,
Using a resolution for that?
yeah, for good contract agreements?
Right. Yep.
Change orders?
Yes, absolutely. Yep. So any agreement, contract, anything that binds a city would be done through resolution. And the reason we do that is those are binding to the city. You're agreeing to something. And so you want that next level of importance, so to speak, for your council or your board to approve. Real quick aside, I think I might refer to this, I can't remember now. Resolutions and ordinances require a majority of the seats of the board or council. Motions can be approved with a majority of those present. So if you have a meeting where only, say on a 5-member city council, and only 3 members show up, 2 of the other 2 members are out of town or whatever, a motion could pass with a 2-to-1 vote. It's the only time that can happen. But a resolution or ordinance would still require 3, all 3 in that case, to be passed. You see the difference there? So that's why for something that's a little bit more important, like a contract, you want to get to that resolution, because that requires a more majority of the council. Ordinances have a little quirk in the law, another quirk. This is council mainly stuff, but it could be other boards and commissions, where you can waive the second and third readings. They have to be read at 3 separate readings and approved 3 separate times, but you can waive the second and third readings with a separate vote, separate item on the agenda, with a 3/4 approval or better. So it's a super majority to do that, but you can. Sometimes cities will do that to speed up the process. When can the mayor vote? In most cities in Iowa, the mayor is not allowed to vote at all under the mayor council form of government. 97% of the cities in Iowa have that form. There's a handful that don't. And the mayor can vote in those cities. Not very many. So the mayor, this comes up all the time. Can the mayor break a tie? No. Can the mayor vote? No. Mayor cannot vote. They are presiding officer, but here's the deal. They can veto. So they do have one legislative power. It's a big one. They can veto resolutions and ordinances. They cannot veto motions. Motions go into effect the minute they're approved. Resolutions go into effect after the mayor's signature within 14 days. Ordinances go into effect after the mayor's signature and or after publication within 30 days. Okay. A lot of rules to follow.
We have 6 members.
6-member council.
So
you're one of the lucky ones.
So mayor can vote.
Okay, so okay. I think there's 12 cities in Iowa. I should have known that before coming down. I think there are 12 cities in Iowa and have the mayor council form, but have an even number of council seats. In those cities, the mayor does get to. Yeah. So you guys are one of the unique ones. So take what all I just said there and shove some of it aside, not all of it. And then conflicts of interest for all of you. Be aware of any potential conflicts of interest. And when you have one, abstain from voting. When do you have a conflict of interest? I don't know. That's for you to decide. Usually it's because you have a personal or financial gain by taking action on that item. If you own a business and the business is seeking to do business with the city, that would obviously be a conflict of interest. If your brother has a business, same story. You have a conflict of interest if the city is going to potentially do business with that company. That's probably the most common one. There's other examples out there.
You work for somebody doing business with the city.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So that's usually what it is. Usually a business tie of some sort. So you got to just abstain in that case. You also have to announce your abstention and explain your conflict of interest. In that case would be, well, I work at this business. I clearly have a conflict of interest. Something like that, or I own this business. Okay,
I know it's probably not necessary, but I also abstain anytime I get a reimbursement from the city business. But
yeah, that's a good idea. I think most council members would agree with that, or most board members too. If you have a reimbursement for some reason, you go to a conference or buy something on behalf of the city using your personal funds, eventually the city's gonna have a reimbursement. And you may need to vote on that. It's not, it's not as concerning,
right.
But it's still, I think, may look bad, like I'm voting for something to be paid to me.
The challenge with that is if you send 3 council members and 4 council members. they all get
You can blame the league for that.
just put it on separate agendas, man.
Right, like one at a time. Right. So that's where it's not as concerning. Like, I don't think any auditors would probably ding you for that, but it's probably just more like a personal, like feeling more comfortable. Like, I don't want to vote on something where it's like, I'm getting a check from the city, but a reimbursement's not to me as eye raising as like, I don't know, if I shouldn't even say, a family member of a council member was working for the city and suddenly got like a 25% raise. I'm like, oh, I wonder how that happened. Those are the things that raise issues, raise eyebrows. Last thing here, real quick, electronic meetings. Back in the day, very few cities used those. Pandemic opened up a whole new world. Now, most cities are fully back to in-person meetings, but there are some cities that are doing hybrid meetings now because Zoom has gotten more and more comfortable for people. That's totally cool. You can do it. In fact, you could always do it under the state code of Iowa, funny enough. But you still, if you're going to use a fully electronic meeting, you have to let the citizens join via that same method, whatever that method is. Okay, that's the biggest rule out there. Again, most cities aren't really doing that, but if you're going to go down that road, practice, get the tech down. It's harder than it looks. The cities that are doing hybrid meetings would probably tell you it's not worth it because it's like running 2 meetings at once and it's tough. But if your citizens are interested, you can do it. It's totally lawful.
How about closed session?
Oh, via electronic means even harder, but you can. You certainly can. If you have a,
you can't control who's in that room with that participating.
yeah, you would have to be very, very careful to only share. What I think what most cities have done that have used closed sessions is have a separate Zoom or Teams or whatever you use for that closed session and only share that link to those people.
Right, I understand that, but what I'm saying is, let's say the council member's wife or husband or something.
Like walks behind. Oh yeah. Like your radar's going off, your alarm bells are going off, like, oh my gosh, she just heard or he just heard everything we just talked about. It's totally confidential. Yes.
Is that legal in our?
It is, but it would be incumbent upon each member to ensure that they're in a room that doesn't have other people in it, which is the trouble with it.
Yeah, well, sometimes we have closed sessions where we have to have a person participate as well.
Yeah.
So it's up to that. person
Yes.
To not have anybody in that room.
Right. So the instructions would be lock yourself into a room that you know. I mean, it's tough. Like, it's just, you would hope common sense prevails, but it may be an innocent mistake. Like, honey, I told you to stay out of this room, like, and here you are showing up. So it's an innocent mistake. You wouldn't probably get much trouble for it, but it obviously looks bad. But especially if it happened repeatedly, then it'd be like, oh no, this looks like a pattern. So just be careful with that stuff. Kind of talked about the broadcasting. A lot of cities these days, actually the question of this that comes to mind, the cities will ask a lot is like, can a citizen like do Facebook Live with our meetings? Like, yeah, they can. Crazy as that is, and I don't know, people need better hobbies, but trust, it's crazy how many times nowadays that someone will say like, we have a citizen come in, plop down like an iPhone, and it's being broadcast out to Facebook Live. And there you go. Anyone around the world can watch your council meeting or your park meeting or whatever. I mean, again, it's goofy to me, but Yeah, people do watch C-SPAN too, right. There's some sickos out there. No, I'm joking. Totally joking, especially Zoom people, I love you. But it's totally lawful, and so it's just another thing you get that's thrown at you. You just gotta, someone's out there. This should always be the case. Just mind your P's and Q's, especially these days, because of the advent of all these things that can immediately put you on Facebook or some other streaming service, and suddenly it's captured. You're over there picking your nose, or you're talking behind somebody's back and flipping the bird, all that stuff. Like, don't do that. I mean, I know you know that, but just especially these days, just assume you're being watched. When you're out doing your city stuff. Hopefully not at home. Now, the last thing I have, just to wrap it all up, what happens when something gets out of order? When you're out of order on the agenda, out of order with discussion, what's your response? Because it's going to happen. It's going to happen. You're going to find yourself struggling in the middle of a meeting.
You mean a person gets out of hand,
Yeah.
out of work?
Yeah, whether it's a council member, a citizen.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that too. There's number sevens on here. What number 7 are we on? Right, yes, I'll come down and be the enforcer. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. That's right. It's the hardest part, in my opinion, of doing all this, is telling either your colleagues up on the table with you and or your citizens to stop talking. It's tough. We're all, the Iowa Nice thing definitely comes into play here. And it's hard to tell your friends and neighbors that, hey, you're out of order. You got to stop talking. But you got to do it. You got to do it. You got to get things back on track. So everything that you take away from this is set rules and then follow those rules.
Probably try to keep the emotion out.
Keep the emotion out, and even tell that person, because you may well know them. You may know them well, and just say, it's not about you. It's not about your issue. We have rules here. We got to follow those rules. You'll have a minute later on, or whenever it is, let's just keep your comments to them.
I think Lori's right. If you kind of keep your calm, even though they may be attacking you personally or something, but you can keep your calm in response to the individual. Sometimes that kind of tends to settle the waters a little bit too, rather than getting angry as well and getting out of hand yourself.
Yeah, the biggest the phrase I'd leave you with is this is the leadership of Indianola, right here, and the fellow members of your boards and commissions and councils. Okay, so your citizens, whether you like it or not, they look to you for leadership. You set the tone. Okay, so if that tone is combative and nasty and name calling, what do you think your citizens are going to do? They're going to follow suit. But if it's calm, it's professional, it's polite, it's respectful, more often than not, they're going to follow that same. They're going to create a culture, and people are going to understand that when I go to a council meeting, when I go to P&Z, it's calm, it's professional. I don't want to be the person that is, called out for being nasty and abusive or anything like that. So be the leaders that you are, and things should work out pretty well. So any final questions, comments? I usually talk a lot. This is even a lot for me, but you have a lot of great questions. I'm very happy to get those and share any wisdom that we have. Anything else from the group? Okay, well, thank you once again for your time and having me down. Thank you for your service to your community. It is super important now more than ever, so keep up the good work. As always, let us know, contact us if you have any questions or need anything.
One thing I would ask you, I attended the conference in Waterloo, Iowa League City's annual conference. Just kind of talk about, if you would, just a bit about the importance of being involved with the organization, whether even IMU and everybody, I know you guys have your own organization too, but at your session, you had things on utilities, you had things on a number of things on live sports. Can you kind of just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for coming. I know we had a chance to chat up there. So the conference is the biggest statewide conference for city government folks each year the league puts on. We rotated around the states, always in September. Next year, we're in Cedar Rapids. We'll put information out on that. We usually have somewhere between 30 and 40 workshops that cover everything.
Yeah.
Open meetings, city budgets, planning and zoning, parks and rec, utilities, human resources, you name it, anything that's important to cities, we put it on. That being said, if you have any ideas for topics or speakers, things you're struggling with, let us know. The membership services team, we coordinate that conference and pick the workshops and speakers each year. We've had Hometown Pride a few different times over the years because that's such a great program. And so anything like that you think your colleagues around the state should hear about or learn from, let me know. Happy to do
Well,
that.
I was just thinking their fiber system that they
Yeah.
installed and put in the city of Indianola, I think probably in record time, under budget and everything else. I think that'd be a great session.
I would love to learn more because, as you all probably know, fiber has become critical to so many communities. And, you know, even 5 years ago, most city governments never would have dreamed that they would be having to get heavily involved in fiber development. And now the flip is true. Like everybody almost has a stake in it at the city government level. If not even, like a couple cities are doing it fully as a city fiber network.
I know you're not the lobbyist, but isn't one of the issues in front of the legislature this session as well on the right of way, control of the cities and the right of way for fiber and competitors in fiber. So I think that is kind of an issue.
Yeah, it's been swirling around. A few years ago, they curtailed some of your ability to set fees
Right.
as a city government for not just fiber, for any service providers to use your right of way to bring out service lines or whatever it may be. The concern there was that the original law was much more restrictive, where basically would have prevented the city from charging anything, which is very concerning because, like it or not, some of these companies get into your right of way and do some trenching or some kind of excavation. Sometimes they don't do a good job of cleaning up, and the city incurs an expense to manage that. Sometimes. I don't,
Yeah.
I'm trying to be as fair as possible. And so the fees are, of course, built not to be any kind of revenue source. It's basically just to have knowing that you're going to have some expense along the way to get that right of way back in shape. And that's all it is. And so that was a big concern. And thankfully, we got it whittled down to much more reasonable. But there's definitely businesses and these providers that think they should have free reign on city property to just do whatever they want. And it's a concern from a management perspective and a development perspective that you would have very little control of your own right of way as a city government. So I would expect something to come back. That's kind of there's been a lot of federal and state money being pumped out for fiber networks, which is wonderful. It's been needed in this state for a very long time. This is the other side to it, though, where all these companies now they see those dollars and they now are getting financial help, so they're invested and incentivized to go build out, but they don't want to run into some cities telling them, well, you got to repair the ground back to a certain condition and you got to pay a fee. That just doesn't set well with them. So
As part of a board or commission, city of Indianola, technically any board or commission here would be able to send somebody to the cities.
absolutely, yeah. And we even have non-members attend sometimes, non-city officials that are maybe thinking about running for office or something like that. But the vast majority are city officials. Anyone from the city is a member of the league, and you're all very, very welcome. And that goes for the conference or any workshop series that we have, anything that we put on. You're all very, very much invited.
Thank you. This has been
Thanks.
helpful.
This has been really good.
You have a problem with this?